Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Uh, we are in the uh, uh, eight, six, fifth, six, seven, eight. Right now, so in this weeks we have discusses, you know, few important themes, namely the conceptions of natures, the contested domains and boundaries of cultures, and uh, we have also covered nature, culture, magic, and science, and religion, nature, and environment, and finally, religion and in an age of environmental crisis. So I'll try to uh, quickly give a brief uh, summary of what we have discussed in the past few weeks, and then I'll be happy to take up questions if there is any. Now, in the conceptions of nature, uh, the first one, uh, okay, we can do in a different way, yeah. So I thought I'll scribble and write something, but that's fine. Now, the first one, that is conceptions of nature. Uh, Over here, an important idea of how nature culture dichotomy was, in some sense, taken to account, and the anthropologists, in some way, realized that uh, people stood in fact engaged in trying to look at what uh, the people they have studied talks about, or in terms of interacting with their physical environment. So therefore, within anthropology, uh, the symbol or symbolic anthropology has devoted its attention to elucidate the logic of the native cosmologists. That is, their worldview, how they make sense of uh, things which are around us, and then they tends to engage in the in terms of trying to represent the objective material forces, and which they have in some way arbitrarily selected, limiting to the factors of the ecosystems, or which is poorly defined levels of productive forces. So that in some way purportedly shaped the structure and evolution of society. Now, except in the Western scientific tradition, the representations of non-humans are expressed contextually in daily actions and interactions, uh, in live in knowledge and body techniques. So, in practical choices and in many of the hasty rituals, all those things goes without saying. Now, the anthropologists reconstruct this mainly the non-verbal or the mental mode of practice from bits and pieces, and in the process, they tend to produce a meaningful pattern. So in this conception of nature, it is also important to look at what are the modes of identification, because the modes of identification again define the boundaries between self and otherness, which are expressed in the treatment of both the human and the non-humans. So therefore, by giving shape to the specific cosmologies and social topographies. So we also have the dimensions of naturalism, which uh, goes on to the set of belief that nature does exist, and certain things in some way or the other owes their existence and development of how we as a human are rooted into it. So therefore, naturalism creates a domain of a specific ontological space, that is a place of order and necessity, where nothing happens without a reason of right course. So when you go through the slides, I'm sure you must have come across uh, Latour, where he convincingly argues that the increased artificialization of nature, that is the operations of science and technology, beginning from way back from the 17th century onwards, perhaps was only made possible in practice because of reinforcement of the polar oppositions of between nature and society. So therefore, the conceptualizations of the roles of humans and non-human, the formation of the standard folk taxonomies of plants and animals are thus often organized according to the principle of what we understood as similarity, that is by a metaphorical scheme. Now we move on to the second theme, the contested domains and boundaries of culture. Now, in this, we tries to employ the oppositions of continuity and discontinuity on the one hand, and on the other, of domination and protection. Now, if you look at the works of Belson, he tries to distinguish three kinds of human environmental relations, namely Orientalism, paternalism, and communalism, each of which would in some sense represent a particular stance with respect to the environmental issues. Now, in the case of the earlier to that is environmental Orientalism and paternalism. Humans are masters of nature, and then the former exploits and the latter protects. So communalism in some way differs from both, in that it involves the rejections of any radical distinction between nature and society, and between science and the practical knowledge. Now, uh, in this particular theme, we also have this idea of culture and choice. Now, I have at length discussed and given an example about the foragers or the hunting gathering society. That is, the foragers' choices make up a strategy of adjustment to a certain ecological conditions they inhabit, and also an adaptive pattern which results from the evolutionary processes and constraints of situation, time, and chance. Now, in this, one pertinent question which arrive is that how behavior of a certain kind has evolved by a natural selection. Now, in the works of Team in Goal, if you look at the behavior must not only have a consequences for reproduction, but also be a consequence of the elements that are reproduced. So we had also seen the examples of the Cree people of northern Ontario. Now what happens among the Cree hunter is that they receive wisdom of his cultural knowledge, that is through successive generations of knowledge which has been handed down from their ancestors, that is far from underwriting his ability to come up with an effective strategy, which actually is liable to prevent man from recognizing the best course action judged. And there has been which has been judged in terms of an objective reckoning of cost and benefit. Now, by contrast to the older generations, the new younger generations among the Cree hunter, their commitment to the traditional cultural values, that is, at least in the eyes of their elders, are pretty much weak, and they readily opt for a more specialized strategy. Now, we also see in this particular theme about the enculturation and enskillment, that is the transmission of certain kinds of cultural information, which must be distinguished from the experience of its particular settings of use. Therefore, there is a contrast between these two forms of learning, that is the social and the individual. Thus, in the social learning, many of these novice absorbs the underlying rules and principles of hunting from the already knowledgeable members of the community. So in individual learning, the novice puts them to use in the course of his activities in the environment. So most often, cultural transmission is viewed as a simple process of copying, in which a whole inventory of rules and representations is being receptive, and then we could in some sense say that he acquires such know-how by observation and imitation. So therefore observation and imitation is important in this enculturations and enskillment. Now the third thing which we have dealt so far is paradigms in the human environmental relations. That is what we have just pointed out: Orientalism, paternalism, and communalism. Now, the first and foremost in this is to look at the distinction between nature and society. That is, if you look at the Marxian approach, they usually tends to restrict to human relations. That is, in terms of analyzing of human environmental relations. Now, in communalism, this paradigm of communalism in some sense rejects and the radical separation of nature and society, object and subject, which emphasize the notion of having a dialogue. So the treatment of this, or this idea of nature and society relationship in the medieval period, is pretty much different from what we have seen in the modern context. So I'm not going into details of that. So let us just refresh our mind by looking into what the other concepts are, like Orientalism and paternalism. So the contrast between, as we had already speak about the contrast between domination and protection with respect to the environment, and the key difference between them is that uh, the former one exploits and the latter protects. So environmental Orientalism suggests that there is a negative reciprocity in terms of the human environmental relations, whereas paternalism implies a balanced reciprocity, presupposing human responsibility. That is, in both the case, humans are masters of nature. Now, the third paradigm, that is communalism, emerged by rejecting the radical separations of nature and society, object and subject, and the modernist assumptions of ordering, certainty and monolith, adding to the dimensions of continuity and discontinuity. So this paradigm suggests a generalized reciprocity in human environmental relations, which in some way tries to give importance to having a dialogue. Now the fourth one, uh, nature, culture, magic, and science. So nature culture dualism forms parts of what we understood as the Western ethno-epistemology, and derives from a non-universal ontological basis. So concepts such as magic and science are investigated with particular reference to their dualist use in the anthropological discourse, to a wider philosophical uh, debates. Now, let me just highlight the importance or the kind of uh, examples from what it once Pritchard had talked about in witchcraft. So Pritchard has argued that uh, judged by the criteria of this Western science, witchcraft does not really exist despite the observed and the recorded fact that the gender notions about witch and the doings display a consistent logic all on their own. So therefore, when one look at ethnoecology, there's the situations of this emic and ethic arises, and ethnoecology has to do with the study of the indigenous knowledge, the traditional ecological knowledge of the natural resources and their exploitation, the way in which they deal with their resources in order to fulfill their subsistence or basic needs. And the prefix ethno, within quote unquote, thus indicates that the specific field of knowledge is that of the observed rather than the observer. So therefore, in this, we see nature, that is the objective, in terms of the cultural images, that is the subjective. So the Western discipline of ecology, as defined by one of its pioneer as the studies of Earth's life support system, whereas ethnoecology remains uh, tied to notions about the natural environment. So the fifth theme which is covered so far is religion, nature, and religion, nature, and environment. Now, in this particular theme, we have dealt at length about the works of uh, the ecological anthropologist Roy Rappaport. And if you look at the works of Roy Rappaport, he argues that religion is central to the continuing evolution of life, and although it has been displaced from its original position of intellectual authority by the rise of this modern science. So his book, Ritual and Religion in the Making of Humanity, is a seminal work, which could be in some sense construed as some degree of religious as well as about religion, and insist that religion can and must be reconciled with science. So therefore, he combined both an adaptive and cognitive approaches to the study of humankind, and he mounts a comprehensive analysis of religion's evolutionary significance, and seeing it as a coextensive with the invention of language and hence of culture as we know it. So within the discipline of sociology and anthropology, ritual and ceremony may designate a large range of social events, not all of which are necessarily religious, or may denote the formal aspects of such events. So in this process, ritual is often taken to be a symbolic form. For instance, among the marine community, the marine ritual cycle constitute a functional ecological theory of rituals in general. So therefore, ritual actions does not produce a practical result of the external world. That is one of the reasons why we often call them rituals. So its function is not related to the world external to the society, but to the internal constituents of the society. So therefore, religion becomes important for the members who are associated with. So it gives the members of the society a confidence, and it also dispels their anxieties. It disciplines their social organizations. So finally, we deal with the theme religion in an environmental crisis. Religion in an in an age of environmental crisis. So we had begun with the definitions or the ideas posited by the World Commission on Environment and Development, which acknowledge that to reconcile human affairs to with the natural laws, our cultural and spiritual heritage can reinforce our economic interest and survival imperative. So, as I had outlined in the course, that for quite some time, religion uh, has not been taken seriously, or it was because the idea of religion could in some way dilute the whole objectivity of science. So therefore, but eventually, uh, it was realized that religion in some way also can contribute in terms of dealing with issues of sustainability, adaptability, so on and so forth. Now, if we look at the historicity of religion, historically, religions has taught us to perceive or to act on the non-human nature in terms of a particular human interest, that is our belief and social structures. So it is important that one needs to really takes into account why religion should be given utmost importance in terms of dealing with the what we are confronting in the environmental ecological crisis. Now, one very pertinent question is also that how has religion shaped our understanding of and our conduct towards nature? Now, from the perspectives of many religions, as we had outlined in the course, I've given examples about Christianity, Buddhism, and Hinduism. And in that, you could see that in most of the Oriental religions, uh, other than the Christian religion, which is perceived to be anthropocentric in nature. So, from the perspective of those Oriental religions, the abuse and exploitations of nature for our immediate gain is perceived to be unjust, immoral, and unethical. So, because in many of these religious texts, mainly from the Buddhist and the Hindu religion, there is a moral teachings regarding the treatment of nature, that human and nature has to, share a reciprocal relationship, or at least in terms of sharing the same space. So this idea of dominance, that is the idea of anthropocentrism, is not seen in those religions. So therefore, we have also at length dealt about the biodiversity conservation ethics in Buddhism, and also in the religion of Hinduism. And I had also cited examples of the Vishnawist community, which have to a large extent being influenced by their religion, and they have conserved nature to a large extent. So since we don't have a query at this point of time, I'll just try to quickly clear some of the questions which are posed in the group. For example, some of you has asked about the nature of the exam. Uh, I'm not going to tell you how many questions will be asked, but it will be the same multiple choice type questions, and each question is perhaps going to carry an equal marks. And some of you has been asking about the PowerPoint presentation, the lecture slides. So my TS will look into that, and hopefully they'll be able to resolve. So if you have any further queries, please post in the group, and then I'll be happy to respond. Thank you.